for some exchange. So I'm here not as a lecturer, but basically as a learner, try to learn from you and try to share also some of my ideas. As Master Liu Xing has stated, the Shaolin tradition, the Zen tradition, is noted for three inseparable dimensions. It's a spiritual discipline focused on a form of practical wisdom and spiritual exercise in the practice of Zen, sitting, meditating, reflecting. And this is the core of the Shaolin tradition for 1500 years. Because of the sitting, which requires some exercise, gradually, from Bodhidharma, who actually faced the war for 9 years, as many of you know, developed the exercises, learning from nature, learning from animals. The exercises eventually evolved into a great tradition of Kung Fu. This is something very well known all over the world now, especially with the demonstration yesterday. It was just remarkable. But Shaolin Temple is also dedicated to the healing of the body, which is medicine, Chinese medicine. It has its own style of nourishing the body and develop a medical tradition. And so Shaolin as Kung Fu, as medicine, and as meditation should be understood in an integrated sense. They are inseparable. And this reminds me of a very fascinating tradition of China, the tradition we call the Chinese tradition. But I would like to look at the Chinese tradition in terms of cultural China, not just political, economic China, which involves not only the People's Republic of China, but Taiwan, Macau, Hong Kong, Singapore, which is an independent state but has 76% of Han Chinese. Of course, all the minorities, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the non-Chinese speaking Muslims, and so forth. That's the first symbolic universe. But also the Chinese diaspora, all of you are included in that tradition. And I particularly thank Dr. Yi for his major contribution to the well-being of the Chinese Americans here. So the Chinese Americans are part of a much larger world of the Chinese diaspora. There are Chinese in Africa, in Iceland, all over the world, and altogether as many as 30 to 50 million people. So that's the second symbolic universe. And the third one, I want to include an increasing number of people who are connected with China, neither by birth nor by marriage. But they're interested in China not simply as scholars, but also as diplomats, as entrepreneurs, as people in the mass media, NGOs, including those who are simply tourists. The only criteria, if the person, whether Japanese, Korean, American, Russian, is interested in China or Chinese matters in a long-term perspective. So we have a very large symbolic universe. And in this large symbolic universe of China, there are 3 to 4 very distinctive features. One is that civilization is often understood as a learning civilization. In this particular connection, learning is learning to be human. How do we learn to be authentically, fully, truthfully human beings? 学做人. This is a very important Chinese idea, 3 characters. And this learning has been characterized as learning for the sake of the self, not for anyone else. You study, you practice Kung Fu, you practice Zen, not for your parents, not for society, not for the universe, but for yourself, for your own body, for your own mind, to cultivate your character. So this idea of learning is very essential as an intrinsic value. The second feature of this culture is not only a learning civilization, but it's also a very tolerant civilization, which means there are many different ways of learning. Therefore, there are many different paths of human flourishing. All these different paths ought to be respected. Hopefully, they enter into communication. So with this tolerance, very early in China, we developed an idea of the three teachings in one. I visited ancient Chinese town of the Ming Dynasty, 17th century, and you could see the two, the shrine, the Taoist shrine and Buddhist temple actually face each other. So people who in Ming Dynasty who visited the Buddhist temple probably also visited the Taoist shrine. Then you could see also a Catholic church not too far away. In other words, even then, the teachings of Buddha, of Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi of course, and of Confucius, not only coexisted, they learn among themselves, they interact among themselves. So this becomes a very important feature. Today, in addition to the three teachings, I have been urging that we need to consider at least 5 teachings. They're all integral part of Chinese culture, including also Christianity and Islam. Christianity came to China in the Tang Dynasty, we call it Nestorian tradition, and of course the Muslim tradition came to China ever since the Yuan Dynasty, 14th century. So they're integral part of the Chinese landscape. In addition to this idea of tolerance, another very important feature, I would like to spend a little bit more time on that, is the Chinese civilization is also a dialogical civilization. 对话的文明, dialogical. So you interact with each other not through confrontation, not through argumentation, not through quarreling, but through communication, civilized communication. How can dialogue happen? The purpose of dialogue is not to persuade. It's not to make a statement about the truthfulness of your own tradition. Certainly not to convert. What is the purpose of dialogue? First of all, the dialogue is an occasion to cultivate the art of listening. Normally, we speak a lot without being able to listen well. Even if we listen, we often listen superficially. How do you listen deeply? You need to have a quiet mind. You need to have an open attitude. So to cultivate the art of listening is a form of spiritual exercise. Well, all the Kung Fu masters ought to be good listeners. Not only listening to the voices from the outside, but listening to your own voice, your inner voice. Because your ability to listen, you can also have the ability to expand your intellectual and spiritual horizons. I'm not a Christian, but I am very proud to say I'm a beneficiary of Christian theological thinking. Precisely because as a graduate student at one of the leading American universities, I studied and interacted with so many outstanding Christian theologians. So I learned a great deal about my own culture. So to listen well, and also is a way of expanding my own intellectual or spiritual horizons. And in addition to your ability to listen and your ability to reflect, it is also extend your horizon. It is also very important for you to enhance what may be called your self-reflexivity, which means your ability to understand yourself and to be critical about your own position. In other words, we need to be rational, to be intellectually sophisticated, while we engage in the effort of Kung Fu and other spiritual exercise that require a great deal of the mobilization of our emotional energy. So in this sense, we want to note, very important to note, we don't want to confuse data with information. Not to confuse information with knowledge. Not to confuse knowledge with wisdom. Sometimes also important to make a distinction between something which even rises above wisdom, which is spirituality. So in this sense, the Shaolin tradition is not simply about data, about statistics, about things that can be quantified. Of course, all kinds of things that can all be quantified, but not just about that. It's not about information alone. Of course, there's a great deal of information. It is not simply about knowledge, even though knowledge is very valuable. It's about practical wisdom, how you learn to live wisely. And also, underlying the Shaolin tradition, which is the Zen tradition, is a form of human spirituality. This is something absolutely critical.